And in many countries, we see young people being used as vehicles for extremism because they're unemployed or underemployed. So for me, there's a direct correlation between the debt crisis and insecurity.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. I caught up with my guest today, Ndidi Okonkwo Nwuneli, at the Aspen Security Forum in mid-July. Ndidi Okonkwo Nwuneli is the president and CEO of the One Campaign, which advocates on behalf of global development, justice, and equal rights with a particular focus on Africa. I was interested in speaking with her at a major conference dedicated to international security precisely because African security issues are far from top concerns of the American foreign policy community. One of the big challenges facing many African countries today is just how heavily indebted they are. Many African countries are spending far more money servicing debts than on their own economic and social programs. Ndidi Okonkwo Nwuneli explains this is already having international security implications and is bound to get worse unless something changes. We also discuss how we can shift the narrative around Africa in general and why including Africa in conversations about global security will increasingly be imperative in the future. This was an excellent conversation, and again, a big thank you to the good folks at the Aspen Security Forum for putting on an excellent conference year after year. Thank you. Now here is my conversation with Ndidi Okonkwo Nwuneli, president and the CEO of the One Campaign, recorded live at the Aspen Security Forum.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, thank you for doing this. One thing I love about the Aspen Security Forum is that it gives me an opportunity to really kind of get a sense of what's like the zeitgeist of the U.S. foreign policy establishment is at any given time. And it's clear that far from the zeitgeist are peace and security issues in Africa. I'm like a veteran of many of these forums, as I'm sure you are as well. Like, how do you explain that?
So what's amazing to me as an African who clearly deeply cares about the continent is that in the U.S. landscape, very little interest, attention, and awareness exists amongst the average American. But even in the foreign policy or in the security landscape, what we've seen is, well, when there's a crisis, people rally around, there's some attention, but not the sustained interest and commitment. And I think there are three reasons for that. I think number one is, I believe it was UCLA that did a study, 10,000 hours of US TV programming. Africa rarely featured. And when it did, it was portrayed as a country and largely negative.
Africa as a country.
Africa as a country. And I think that pervades even the leadership of the country, where you see significant ignorance or lack of awareness about Africa as a continent with 54 countries, diverse, many growing, many contributing, a continent that's producing the vast number of young people. 70% of our population is under 35. And the size of the population, 1.4 billion at the moment, doubling. And then by the turn of the century, the largest growth potential around economic energy, skills, capabilities from a continent. So I think that lack of awareness of how critical this continent is, not just in terms of minerals and natural resources, which we're often pigeonholed, or a crisis, but really a continent of opportunity, a confidence with young people who who are vibrant, who have contributions. So I think that's the first big bucket, is really how do we raise awareness about Africa's contributions, Africa's relevance, and Africa's importance. The burden is on Africans themselves and on Friends of Africa around the world to do that and to change narratives. The second issue I noticed is that the reporting from the continent is usually around a crisis, a war, a low-grade war, conflict, corruption, the seas that keep on following us around. And I think part of it is that we haven't gotten enough balanced journalism around the stories and the positive stories and the stories of growth. And so that really is critical. But when we think about Africa as a continent and the U.S. historical connections with the continent, they're actually quite deep. And the U.S. has been seen as a very important friend and ally, a very important export partner, an import partner as well, a trading partner for critical minerals, for agricultural produce, but we don't quantify it or celebrate it and really documents that trade. And so there's a missed opportunity there. So for me, my big push through my role at the One Campaign is to raise awareness about how pivotal Africa as a continent is, to build new champions and allies who fight for the resources and the policies required to transform Africa, and to ensure that we really shift the relationships and deepen these relationships so that they're win-win and mutually beneficial.
I mean, you're like preaching to the converted here.
Yeah.
I think listeners will be well aware that I share all of your perspectives on this. But, it seems like one of my frustrations is in forums like this, and I'm not singling out Aspen, but generally in the U.S. foreign policy establishment, to the extent that Africa is considered as like a foreign policy opportunity, it's typically done in a conversation about competition with China. And I just wonder, how do you change that narrative? Because that is the dominant narrative now, that Africa is a place where the U.S. can compete with China, not that Africa is a place with its own agency.
I think we are working really heavily on increasing the African voice and African agency at the One Campaign. We believe that it's critical that Africans demand what we want, not what the world thinks we need. And we're building out influential circles all over the continent, increasing our visibility and our agency. And now that African Union has a seat in the G20, we're excited about that, but we also want to ensure that we're using these moments, these convenings, to also push for what we need as a continent. And I'll tell you that the challenge remains the ability to find the right champions on both sides of the divide, right? Who understand the concept of long-term mutually beneficial relationships. Trade is one long-term mutually beneficial relationship. Education across the board, where we have African students coming to the U.S., African diaspora in the U.S. I often challenge people that if the African doctors and nurses decided they weren't going to work, we would see a change in health systems in the U.S. because we're actually a critical force now. And you see that replicated in many industries. So the African diaspora has a role to play in amplifying their voice. They are taxpayers in America. They contribute to America and they care deeply about their home countries. And so we're galvanizing them in unusual ways because their voice has to be heard. But ultimately, I think it's beyond Africa as a continent. I would love to see a Nigeria-US relationship deepened. We saw that with Kenya and Ruto's visit. Obviously, Kenya has a lot of complexity. But when Ruto came, it wasn't Ruto representing Africa. It was Ruto representing his country, Kenya, and the United States. And we've identified a few critical countries, South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, Zambia, and Senegal, where we feel like there's so much potential to think through bilateral relationships, cross-sector relationships, and then the trading relationships as an Africa Continental Free Trade Area.
What distinguishes those countries that you named? Why are those the ones that you picked as potentially ripe for a deepened relationship with the United States?
Well, the first thing is population for Nigeria.
Well, yeah, Nigeria makes intuitive sense.
Huge country, lots of diaspora connections, lots of historical relationships, English speaking, etc. Senegal, I think, is a very interesting country because it's one driven by a young population, a young president, and the youth have spoken. And the president seems really committed to transformation And it's a very critical country in the Francophone region. And we believe that with the right political will, the right commitment on the ground, the youth vibrancy and energy, there's a lot of interest in not only cultural diversity and agricultural potential, but also even the oil and gas sector and the opportunities around that. So for me, Senegal is a very interesting and important country right now, and it could be a test case for how we scale out some of these other interventions. Zambia is very interesting because not only is there political will, but it also has green minerals and a commitment to the climate transition. It's really been affected by climate, but it's a very innovative country when it comes to critical solutions to the climate crisis and looking at green minerals. And we've identified these 5 countries because we believe that not only do they represent the diversity of the continent, but also unique business opportunities and political will to transform and to build out and scale growth.
So it was interesting to me that you picked Zambia, which is also, at least to a certain extent, emblematic of one of the great challenges facing Africa right now, which is this debt crisis.
Yes.
Zambia is one of the more indebted countries. There are dozens of others in the region that are paying, most of their, government expenses go to debt servicing at this point. Can you just map out that problem, explain this problem? Because it really is like a post-COVID reality for much of Africa. And I don't think it's something that a broader audience really kind of gets the significance of it.
So we're definitely facing a huge debt crisis on the continent at the moment. I think the estimates from last year was that we paid out about $185 billion in debt repayments across the continent, which is staggering. Let me use a few examples as a case study. Kenya spends 75% of its tax revenue on debt repayments. A country like Ethiopia spends only $8 per capita on health, but $26 per capita on debt servicing. Now, what happened? A lot of African countries took very expensive debt from Eurobonds, sometimes 3.5 to 5% interest rates. They took some loans from China. They took some bonds across the board that were not the right type of financing for the infrastructure investments, the health and the education investments they required. And so we're in a situation where children essentially are being born into debt, and more money is leaving the continent that is coming in. And this has crippled many countries, but there are 13 countries that are either at the brink of collapse from an economic perspective and are at the brink of defaulting on their debts. Now, what does this mean for Africa as a continent? It means that our countries are not able to invest in growth. They're not able to invest in infrastructure, and they're choosing to repay debt as opposed to grow their economies. And that choice is one that no country should ever have to make, one no president should ever have to make. And so I think we're at a critical point in the world where we have to determine how we're going to support these countries through this difficult period, and how we're going to ensure that we find creative mechanisms, not only combining some level of debt forgiveness linked to clear performance indicators, linked to climate support indicators, but we're also going to have to think about how we scale concessional financing through, for example, the World Bank IDA 21 replenishments and other mechanisms like the African Development Fund to really think through how we support these countries through this difficult time.
So, we're at a security forum. So I want to ask you the security portion of that question. If those remedies don't come, if the 13 or so countries that are in the deepest debt distress default or in some other way descend deeper into economic calamity, are there discernible security outcomes, security implications for that?
We're already seeing evidence of that. I mean, in the last few weeks, we've seen protests and riots in Kenya almost every day, led by young people, directly linked to the debt repayment crisis. And these are young people saying, we're going to stand up and say that the government has to do something to protect its people. We saw that Kenya couldn't meet payroll for some of the government workers. This directly affects families. When families can't pay their children's school fees, they can't cover their housing costs, and they can't feed, what happens? You have children on the streets. When children and young people are on the streets, it leads to conflict. It leads to riots. And in many countries, we see young people being used as vehicles for extremism because they're unemployed or underemployed. So for me, there's a direct correlation between the debt crisis and insecurity, and it can snowball very, very quickly if we don't take immediate action. So for me, it keeps me up at night that children are being born into debt that they had no hand in creating.
I mean, there is this like urgency. It's like a ticking time bomb.
Definitely.
Yet it's not something that has like penetrated the consciousness of the American security, national security, or foreign policy establishment. It's, not something that's keeping, senior officials up at night, even though you have this like looming catastrophe.
Yeah, and for me, that's why I am here at the Security Forum, to raise this issue and to really underscore how connected we are as a people. I think oftentimes you can be in a place like Aspen and feel far removed from the realities of the rest of the world. And unfortunately, a crisis in one part of the world quickly snowballs into others. When you think about some of the large populations, we think about Ethiopia, 120 million people, Nigeria, 250 million people, 450 million by 2050. We have a refugee crisis if we do not deal with it. And no region wants to deal with a refugee crisis. We've seen the crisis in regions around the world. And so we need to take urgent action. We need to support these countries to get through this difficult period. And it's going to take a combination of strategic thinking, the right enabling policies, accountability on both ends, concessional financing through IDA 21 and other interventions like that. And the good thing is African leaders are speaking up. I was in Nairobi back in June where President Ruto convened African presidents and African finance ministers, and together with one voice, we advocated for the World Bank to increase the IDA 21 payout. And I think 120 billion has been identified as the amount that we're trying to raise. We're going to need other countries to step up and really make significant contributions to IDA. And it's a tough time for many countries.
And there's an IDA replenishment coming up. IDA, for those
IDA
who are
21,
unaware.
International Development Association, which is a concessional financing window that the World Bank has been offering to many countries. And we've seen countries graduate from IDA. Korea is a perfect example. We've also seen African countries start contributing to IDA. And IDA gives, loans at 0 to 2%, depending on the need. And about 70% of IDA's resources are being channeled to Africa around important infrastructure investments, energy investments, health and education investments. And we would like to call on more countries to contribute to IDA, especially countries that have made a commitment to being good neighbors, to overseas development assistance at 7%. And one's data shows that giving by many of our countries in G7 are at the lowest level in 50 years. In fact, we looked at from 1974 till 2022, and we saw that this is the lowest level from most G7 countries. And so it's time for G7 countries to step up to their commitment to give. And IDA 21 is a very important intervention that they can support.
So it's interesting to me. I'm thinking, if I were to be interviewing the head of the One campaign 24 years ago, you had been mentioning debt relief and debt forgiveness, because that's why the One campaign principally was launched in the first place. You can see Bono running around the world asking for debt forgiveness around the millennium. And it's interesting to me that that's not what you're emphasizing these days. Why is that? Like, what's changed?
Well, for me, it's not enough to say debt forgiveness without talking about economic growth and a pathway for graduation from overseas development assistance. It was mentioned yesterday, actually, in the conversation about China. And I was very happy when they mentioned that, Bono, through the One campaign, pushed for that.
This was like the big,
yes.
This was like the raison
and guess
d'etre
what?
of the One
In 2025,
campaign,
we're going to have another Jubilee year. And the Catholic Church has actually identified another commitment to fighting for debt forgiveness.
Okay.
But what we at the One campaign believe is debt forgiveness is just part of the puzzle. It's not the full puzzle. You need to have a comprehensive approach to help countries grow and to ensure that the most vulnerable are supported. And so it's the right policies, the right investments, and instruments to drive growth. And yes, we see debt forgiveness as a piece of that puzzle, but it's accountability on the part of the donor countries and the funder countries, and accountability on the part of the countries that are receiving the concessional support. And I think we need to hold both accountable. And One campaign is very explicit that our vision is that Africa will be recognized as an equal player in the international development landscape, and that what we do in Africa to promote healthy lives and economic opportunity will demonstrate that it is possible to do this in other parts of the world.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. It's been wonderful engaging with you.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.